I'm Dave Russell from Beam Software, look after enterprise strategy. Brad?
Yeah, I'm Brad Jervis, Senior Cloud Architect with Offsite Data Sync.
Excellent. And I have to give a shout out to Nick who put together this slide. It looks like a magazine cover or something. I don't know if magazines still exist, but the digital versions still do.
Yeah, Nick's always great when he puts these things together. I gotta give a shout out to him for sure.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we'd be remiss if we didn't indicate a download. And what this download is Brad and I were kind of riffing the other day about some things that we're going to chat about in this discussion. But what we wanted to do is we're going to show you some fresh data. And by fresh, I mean it just came in hot this week, a global survey. We're actually going to publish this data in the February timeframe. However, this is a continuation or refresh off of a document that we published in late January of this year. This is the QR code, and we're pointing to the current document, which was January 2020, but we'll also be able to send to you in approximately the February timeframe the updated and even larger global survey based upon some of the results that we're actually going to talk about today. And I guess I probably shouldn't drift off of that too quickly. I'll dwell for a moment and then we'll make sure that people can grab that. Okay, so we got three areas we kind of want to tee up the conversation with, but I'll turn it over to you, Brad.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Dave, we were kind of talking 2 weeks ago or last week, and I don't recall exactly when it was, but how things have changed so drastically this year and kind of what we're expecting to see as a result of a lot of these changes, with everyone working from home for obvious reasons and everything. So we're going to mostly talk about three things and how we see those kind of changing. Well, first of all, how they changed in 2020, but how those changes might kind of continue to change or become new paradigms in 2021 moving forward, as people have seen some of these things like it's okay to work from home. Sometimes people are even more productive doing so. First off, we're going to touch on disaster recovery. So 2020, we learned a lot of things. And with these new paradigm changes, as I mentioned, we have to kind of rethink our disaster recovery strategy a little bit. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Then we're going to talk about a little bit of the new work from home world, just a little bit how that's going to be continued to be impacting, some of these decisions that IT folks have to make with regards to backup and also DR as well. And also another thing that I don't think a lot of people actually really consider is the cybersecurity changing threatscape and how some of these changes actually affect the world of just protecting our data. And now that everyone is interdispersed all over, maybe on non-public or public Wi-Fi or wherever else, that paradigm shift kind of changes just a little bit.
Yeah, great point. And, if I think about disaster recovery and what's been changing, I feel like disaster recovery, every survey I've seen for at least 15 years says next year people are going to get more focused on disaster recovery. And, next year is always the year, right? I mean, we do that in our personal lives. We're now pretty far into this current year. So what is it? Middle of December, literally. So a couple weeks away from a new calendar year. So as we're all going to start to reflect on, maybe personal goals, things that we didn't get done this year that we want to make sure we focus on next year. From an availability or resiliency perspective, looking at disaster recovery, one of the things I think, Brad, is that, we all had the pass at the beginning of this year, meaning pick your time frame, but roughly middle of March, I think the whole world was in the throes of COVID-19. Some of us, sooner than others, or sooner than maybe what we experienced, around here in the North American theater. But we got a pass, meaning it was okay that we were surprised in the sense that this is truly not even a generational, it's a kind of in human history, not something like this has been fully experienced. However, we don't get the surprise card in 2021, right? We now have to be prepared. We now have to understand that these kinds of eventualities can happen. And to your point that data is going to get created very geographically dispersed. Data is going to get accessed from all over the place. So, what do you think that backdrop means for DR in literally a couple weeks from now when we're in 2021.
Yeah, no, and I mean you make a great point because disaster recovery is something that a lot of folks just say, yeah, that's I'll look at that later. It's something that I can push to the back burner because, what are the odds I'm going to use it,
Right.
but it's like insurance for your car. You probably hopefully will never have to use it, but if you don't have it when you need it, well, you're you're going to have some issues and it's not going to be a fun time. But as to your question about how it's going to change, well, a lot of DR strategies used to revolve around, maybe setting up a secondary office. Let's say, there's something that impacts the office where everyone's working or a data center. And the strategy is mostly resolved around trying to find either another office or spinning up that in another data center. But having folks all still work in the same environment all
Mm,
together, just maybe in a different place or accessing the data in a different way. Now, I think with everyone's kind of forced push into the work from home kind of paradigm, I think a lot of DR strategies we're going to shift rather from being let's find another office space to everything else to let's just have people work from home again. It wasn't a disaster where COVID-19 happened, where it's just kind of like a flash, but we didn't have a long time to prepare to, get the SSL licenses or, set up the new firewall or increase our bandwidth or everything to kind of handle everyone working from home. But it was still a very short amount of time. So I think that this whole thing was kind of a good experiment to see, is that a valid way to work? And I think largely people have found that, yes, this can very much work. Obviously, depending on your organization, might be different for everyone. But I mean, I talk to a lot of customers, Dave, and honestly, I have not heard many of them who say that this has been a bad thing, that this has been a bad
mhm.
experiment. So you will. So I'm fully expecting that a lot of my DR conversations are going to be shifting away from that. Let's find another site to everything else to let's just make people work from home.
Yeah, yeah, and I think back to I remember 2005 when United States at one point was kind of line of sight of three different hurricanes. Katrina is something that many of us certainly heard about, and that obviously did hit land. Houston was threatened at one point. It didn't come to pass, but I remember talking with some of the organizations, and some of their lessons learned were, wow, we just now in retrospect wish we would have invested in relatively simple infrastructure. So I asked people from a DR perspective, they failed over one group that I had at a uh, conference and on a panel on DR, and what does this mean? They said, the aspects of data we actually had pretty well understood. What we missed, if you want to say lessons learned, were simple things like I wish we would have just had like $300 or $400 home generators for the IT staff. So just like, you don't normally think about some of those things until, to your point about insurance, and you don't think about it until you have to think about it. And obviously, your closing speed to react is severely compromised. But the reason I mention that is, so there was an element of surprise. And I actually know people that have home generators. I'm not one of them, but it's not actually that uncommon. But to your point about we probably don't restore to say 2019 and everybody get back on the highway, everybody get back in the office or subways and what have you. I just think looking up and down the streets, and I even moved during a pandemic to a different state, but I always marveled, there's a reason why Jeff Bezos and Amazon generated enormous wealth and gains, and it's because I look at the boxes on recycle day, all of us have bought more gear, right? We've all
Yeah.
got new computer systems, new monitors, headsets, cameras, printers, you name it. So from that simple infrastructure perspective, the ability to work from home, whether an employer helped you or you invested yourself, the kind of capabilities that you probably have and probably improved your connectivity or your speed as well. So just making the point that where for some of us this was difficult, we maybe didn't have a proper workspace, we didn't have proper equipment. I don't want to say that's fully solved, but I feel like for a vast majority of people that's in place now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even little things that don't necessarily have to do with IT, but like you mentioned, Amazon, we see, they're doing quite well, but, delivery food service
Yep.
companies, they kind of got rocketed into the forefront of this. So it's kind of changing not even just IT and DR and everything. It's changing the way of a lot of just how we kind of live our lives, and work obviously plays a huge part into that.
Yeah, great point. Well, I teased up some survey results, so let's hit one of them. There we go. So this looks a little bit like an eye chart. Let's decompose this a little bit. So this is brand new, fresh data, and the link that we've got to be able to look at the January report, what that's actually reflective of, and I'll just peer off to the side of my presenting monitor. We asked people earlier this year what their actual plans were and what they anticipated 2 years later. So this is as of January, what they said they were doing, and then where they thought they would be. The data we literally just got back was what people think that they're going to really be doing now, and now meaning the 2021 instance of this, and then what they thought, 2 years later from there. It's not so often you see this, steady rise or very clean path without any kind of discontinuity. But from a business continuity disaster recovery perspective, and this was globally over 1,800 organizations. So the N is, I would say statistically valid. Not so surprising, a lot of interest in disaster recovery as a service provider as compared to self-managing between your own data centers. The problem, of course, though, Brad, that's kind of rarefied air. Like, the Brad and Dave company don't have a secondary data center, right? We don't
Yeah.
have that luxury of, more brick and mortar. And you can see that the trend was, well, they thought in a couple years' time that that would be increasing dramatically. But this curve, and I would argue COVID in this 2021 actual, meaning what happened since January of 2020 to just literally this week, pushed people in more of a cloudy direction. And the anticipation is that's actually going to accelerate fairly dramatically over what they thought just earlier this January, about 9 months ago. I'm sorry, 11 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about kind of the rationale behind this, a lot of folks who do have these secondary data center sites and everything, a lot of this equipment that they have is either old or going to be coming out of life and everything like that. So the decision is going to reach them very soon. Well, do we, spend a bunch more capex dollars to, revitalize this data center, and kind of this is the life that we're going to go down, or do we kind of look into some of these cloud providers that are available and use those for DR? And a lot of times, especially with some of the changes that we've already talked about with DR, and those changes moving forward, I think that there's a much easier discussion to have around not reinvesting into the environment and kind of keeping that up just in case you need it.
Mhm.
There's a good argument for having our resources dynamically available in a cloud provider, that we can use at any point, but we're not just paying for hardware to just sit around in the hopes that, or not the hopes, but in hopes that we'll never have to use it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a skills expertise component to that as well. And I'm not suggesting that people don't have the right kind of administrative staff. It's actually the challenge might be that staff has been tasked, overtasked, arguably, with doing many, many other things. I mean, a lot of us have been stuck in operational mode. We're trying to literally get by. We're trying to keep the lights on. We've all heard like, just run, grow, transform. Well, we're run, run, run mode right now for a lot of us. So the notion of how do you modernize, how do you look at new asset management plans, and while simultaneously trying to think of new workloads, embrace more cloud architectures, et cetera. That's a lot to take on. It's a lot to take on by yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, David, almost sounds like you're saying that a lot of IT folks just have far too much on their plate, but
Yeah, this just in, right? That's yeah. If we're going to make that bold prediction, but that is, I mean, I think a lot of us are beyond overtasked. And so, the old notion of, you've got to work smarter, not harder. Part of that smarter is how can you, I use the phrase, how can you import help, import skill, you know, get subject matter experts that do this to be able to help you get over the curve faster and to do it with less risk.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy the way that things have changed. And I'm going to go back in time just a little bit here since we're on this topic. A few years ago, I worked for a managed service provider, and when we would do a disaster recovery initiative with a customer, like doing a test or just actually putting in a whole DR system and drawing up the documentation, that would be easily 2 weeks of work.
Mm.
Probably 80 hours of consulting time. With a lot of the new technologies out there, specifically with Veeam and some of the Veeam availability orchestrator and tools that we can use to kind of make these things easier, and also just from having more experience in doing DR, over the years, that's probably cut down to a quarter of the required time. So it's crazy to see how even in just that amount of time, which is maybe 6 7 years, we've taken something that used to be this huge, massive project that was kind of always the dread of every single IT administrator to now it's really not that bad anymore. And there's a lot of great technologies out there. But my fear is that some people aren't looking into these DR strategies and things of that nature just because, frankly, there's still this looming dread of this DR project. And a lot of folks that I talk to, they're always shocked just about how easy it is, not necessarily easy all the time, but how much easier it is than they kind of thought that it would be.
Oh, it's interesting. I used to, when I was an analyst, I used to try to encourage people to improve their recovery or resiliency. And that same notion where people have it in their minds, this is going to be a Herculean effort. This is going to require so many people to buy in or sign off, etc. And that may be true, not trying to diminish the challenges involved, but I used to say sometimes, you may not be able to fix everything, but you can fix something. Pick a workload, or if you're a very large organization, pick one business unit, pick one location, and get some experience, get a win, get some victory and ramp up. But I've heard the same thing, and honestly, not trying to be a commercial, but I have heard many people say, when I went to a service provider, this actually wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. And, I think in part it's because you're not over double taxing your staff, meaning keep everything that's currently in place while simultaneously trying to introduce something new. That's a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask in this current kind of climate that we're in. So it doesn't surprise me that you've heard people say, this wasn't as daunting as I thought it might be.
Yeah, no matter what, you're taking an entire environment, or usually most of an entire environment, and just kind of spinning it up somewhere else. And there's some issues that go along with that, and you have to make sure that you're really buttoned up as far as knowing what your dependencies are and everything else like that. But as long as you do that pre-work, a lot of folks are just really surprised to be like, wait, we can get this down to where I just press a button and fail over. Yeah, you can certainly do that, depending on how your environment goes and how well it's documented and everything. Helped many customers kind of achieve that one click failover, and then boom, 5 minutes later, their services are coming up and running. So it's certainly a possible, but as to your point, it does require just a little bit of some know-how and making sure that everything is all the bells and whistles are lined up and everything is going to be put in place for that one click to happen.
Yeah, and maybe I'm showing my age, but I feel like you learn experientially, which is a really nice way of saying you get bumps and bruises and hopefully not decapitated or lose a limb along the way, but you learn the hard way, right? You learn through trial and error with the emphasis on error that creates a feedback loop to improve going forward. And if you can short circuit that, if you can partner with someone that already understands some of the gotchas, that understands some of the configuration issues that you can bump into, it's only going to deliver a more predictably favorable result.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
So let's look at another side, just transition to a new topic now. Same survey, we asked, what does modern look like? This N is even larger. We're approaching 3,000, 2,800 global enterprises. And if this is a little bit of an eye chart, I will parse through this. But oops, I apologize. Don't click the button. I'm a software guy, not a hardware guy. But what's interesting that you just said, and I swear this, we didn't plan this or pre-discuss this, but this is stack ranked. The smaller bars or that gray bar in the bottom is what was the single most, it's a choose one in the poll, right? Choose the most important. And then the purple bar, the larger ones up top, are choose all that apply to you in terms of which would you consider to be a defining aspect of modern or innovative. And that orchestration, that notion of automated recovery comes to the forefront. And I'll play pop psychologist. I'll give you my thesis on why that is. I think it's because there's a recognition we don't have enough people to do what needs to be done rapidly and predictably, correctly, and in the right sequential process at at our hands, at our beck and call. And in fact, if the pandemic has shown us, anything, and now you unfortunately you mix in such things as cyber threats, and we've been hearing more and more about that. Well, I was going to say this week, but it feels like, really every passing week we've got more examples. So against this expanding threatscape, I'll call it, and against the pandemic backdrop that let's be as optimistic as we want to be, but January 1st, 2021 doesn't suddenly radically, play out any different than December does this year. So I think that notion that, hey, I've got to be able to automate this, I've got to be able to ensure that I'm not leaving something for opportunity for error.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another big driving factor to that is that folks have discovered that automation is basically it helps you, as you mentioned, handle all these large workloads and everything. It
Mm,
allows you to do more with less resources, with less time on your hand and everything like that. And with disaster recovery, I think it's one of the key things that it's so programmatic. I mean, most of a DR strategy or a DR plan is all just programmatic. Okay, you spin up this server at this time, validate this server is running, then spin up this server, validate that this is working, and all of that. I mean, it's basically just a blueprint for
mm.
automation. So I think it's kind of just one of the perfect mixes of something where we want to start automating more of our tasks. And this is already there with a blueprint. It's all just about finding the tools, maybe, building the tools yourself, building those individual tests and everything like that to be actually able to run these. And with a lot of products like, Veeam Availability Orchestrator and the like, we're able to use those to kind of automatically test these things. So rather than just one click failover, as I mentioned, it's also one click testing. So you
Mm.
spin up the DR environment in like a sandbox, validate everything's working, and then you can get a nice little report at the end of it that, green, 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 and then you could pass it to management. Here, look, I did my DR test for the year. And all you had to do was press a button. I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't always work that easily, but that's kind of the goal I think that we're trying to get to from being in the DR field is to try and get as close to that as possible in the as easiest way.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned testing because I feel like testing's been a dying art for a long, long time. And the unfortunate thing is, back when I was an industry analyst, I would speak to organizations. They would say, "We're preparing for our DR test," and I would hear this over and over again. And finally, I started asking, "What do you when you say you're preparing for it? What do you mean?" Essentially, what they meant is they're preparing to make sure they pass it. They rigged the game to win. And it's because the perception was if we fail the test, that's negative, it's punitive. So we're going to try to come up with the simplest workload, the simplest application, whatever the case may be, such that we know we can guarantee success. And that's sort of like being a sports team saying, well, we're a professional team, but we'll play the high school junior varsity team because we know we can get a win. Yeah, that may be true, but that actually doesn't really help you. And the notion now, conversely, where you mentioned something like Veeam Availability Orchestrator, you can schedule that to automatically go see what kind of recovery point, recovery time objectives you're capable of getting now. And now's the key word because configuration drift is a real thing. So that's why you need to continually validate to ensure, did the environment change? Do I have data growth? Did my infrastructure change? And I really can't encourage people enough to go validate your systems. If you get anything out of this whatsoever, it's don't leave things to chance. I think this year has certainly taught us that that's not a winning strategy. But some of the threats that we've talked about, and I'll even switch to maybe this next slide because the causes of outages are amazing. Meaning, when I first saw this data, I will tell you we're munging together from what we surveyed last year and what we just surveyed, and then what the causes were over the multiple years. It's not one thing. It's a lot of things. I mean, things as an industry, I think we've sometimes some almost fooled ourselves into believing that equipment doesn't go down, that networking configuration issues aren't real, that patches don't go badly. And that's even before you get to cyber, which is obviously very, very real. But just look at this list, Brad. Server issues, networking or infrastructure issues, app software, storage hardware, operating system. Yeah, we have human error as well, but look how far down the stack you may need to go before we actually get into what we typically think is the greatest cause of error is human issue. So the reason is not to be negative in showing this, but if we think about, what's different about disaster recovery, it's almost you have to think of the converse. What's the same? And what's the same is there are a lot of different things that can take down your environment before we even get to external threats like cyber.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that, IT and all of the um, systems and infrastructure that's needed to keep a business running is very complex stuff. And that's why you can have someone at Amazon who enters in, a single wrong command and suddenly half of AWS goes down, as it happened a few years ago.
Yeah.
And, there's human errors like with things like that. But my point is it's so hard for us to understand all of the interconnectedness of all these systems. And I'm sure there's tons of IT administrators just like me that have done something in the past and it goes ahead and breaks something over there. And I say, oh, well, okay, well, let me figure out why that broke now. You know what I mean? Like something to fix one thing has ripple effects through the environment that may be affecting something else through other means. And to your point, it's very easy for us to imagine that human error is the cause of all of these issues. But a lot of it is just frankly the complexity of everything. Um, and I just wanted to mention one thing that going back to your point about kind of the importance of testing, because I really want to stress this. In fact, all of these reasons right here kind of emphasize the need to test. The fact that we
Mm.
have all of these potential issues that we have to deal with, all these things to prepare against, everything that goes along with that. But one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of times the communication between departments isn't always the best. And IT may actually go through and have, this is our critical application. This is what we use. This is the most important thing to bring up right now. This is everything that, that we need in order to get the business up and running. A year later, even though that platform or software product is um, you don't know if it's still as critical as you thought. And maybe this
Mm.
other new thing that we've, recently put in has become more critical. Maybe this is the new business, unit that we're actually concentrating on in the organization. And we need to kind of go back and test and also find our users and have them validate that they can do their job. Because if all of our services come up and running, that's all wonderful and everything. But until we can validate our users are able to do their job, we really haven't done an actual test. Yeah, we see lots of green and everything, but we really need validation from the user perspective to make sure that we kind of bridge that communication gap between IT, sales, accounting, whomever else it might be.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Brad, because, success isn't just bring the bits back. It takes an application, it takes infrastructure, but it takes basically a whole, sequential list of things before a business process is back. And I remember, thinking about, backup and recovery when flexed for disaster recovery. Organizations sometimes might say, "Oh, well, the restore's done." But that doesn't mean you're suddenly back in business. It just means you got data back that now can facilitate getting or starting the process of getting operating systems back, getting machines back online, applications. Maybe it's a cascaded application. It's customer facing. You need web hosting. You need that back end. You need a lot to suddenly plug in before suddenly the company can make money again and they're fulfilling orders. So it's a good point, and against this backdrop again, just there's so many things that are going to be going on and that could cause discontinuity or threaten your resiliency. One of the things though that I think is very interesting about disaster recovery though is in my mind it's one of the ideal candidates to look at for an organization that wants to exploit cloud capabilities or get further into their cloud activity.
Yeah, it's kind of a good way to test the waters and to see if being cloudy is good. A number of years ago when virtualization kind of first came on the market, a lot of people were really wary about it. Okay, we'll put our kind of file servers and things that aren't really too, CPU intensive or memory intensive up there. But no way would we ever virtualize a SQL database server. Like that's just, or an Exchange server. No, 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 that's terrible practice. And then
Right.
as we've kind of done it and validated that things are able to work in a virtualized environment, that you can run database applications on a virtual machine versus a physical server. People started more embracing it and took all the benefits of the virtualization and everything that comes along with that. I think we're going to start to see the same thing with cloud. A lot of people saying are really afraid of the word cloud. There's a lot that goes into it. Are my applications going to run as effectively? What about the delay between my users connecting up to the cloud? And we might find, just like with virtualization, that a lot of those fears have been mostly unfounded.
Mm.
And doing disaster recovery and having users work from the DR environment inside the cloud. I mean, I've worked with tons of customers that are like, wow, I can't believe how well this performs up here. And our users were able to connect and do their job. And, I kind of set the expectation, it's going to be a little bit slower. It's DR, just kind of have that understanding. But where I was expecting users to come to me and complain about any of that, nothing. They said it was, just like working from the office. And, I think that kind of gives people the proof they need to say, you know what, maybe this big bad cloud thing isn't that scary of a monster. And just like virtualization, we can actually, use all the benefits that it brings to us.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I can remember, I don't know when, I'll just say maybe it was around 2007, maybe late 2000s. VMware in particular made a big push to say, hey, we want to get out of the back office and into production class environments. And I don't want to say it was overnight, but it kind of seemed like very, very rapidly people went from heck no, I'm not going to put anything mission critical on a hypervised infrastructure. It's going to be on bare metal to actually the opposite. You had to go and request or prove your case why you needed actual bare metal or physical machinery anymore. And I can imagine a world. I'm always a big believer that history repeats itself, and I can imagine a world where I think if there's a silver lining or one of them for this year, it's that it's accelerated many organizations' interest, but actual usage and adoption of cloud-based services. And I think the organizations that took this year as an opportunity to kind of self-assess where they were at and maybe go further faster on some of the plans that they've been on. I don't have a great scientific evidence, but in the conversations, at least anecdotally, it sure looks like those organizations weathered this issue much, much better and got through or saw recovery much sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. The folks that have already been thinking about this and that have already included work from home as part of their DR strategy. In fact, I've got a number of customers who we kind of prepared them for work from home with their disaster recovery environment. And as a result, they were a little ahead of the game when this whole thing started happening around March because they already had this plan in place.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, no large evidence or anything, but the people that were forward thinking and already had these plans in place, they weathered the storm a lot easier, and they didn't have to run to get licenses or get everyone computers or anything. All the legwork had already been done. So it's possible that that might also act as a factor for people moving more over to that quicker as they see some of the other folks in the industry and they said, oh wow, I've had to stay up all night, getting users access, everything else. And how about you guys? Oh yeah, we already had this in our DR plan. So it really wasn't that big of a deal for us. We just had to, make it as part of actual work and adjust a few things and we were good.
Yeah, yeah, great point. Well, let's transition to, our third topic. It's like no IT conversations complete without discussion on cyber, unfortunately.
Especially now.
And yeah, I mean, it's it's like one of those phrases, just when you couldn't get any bigger, couldn't get any worse, couldn't get any more examples, we get more examples. It does get bigger, it does get worse. And, you know, we all want to be optimistic, but at the same time, we have to be realistic. And the reality is the threatscapes are rising. And, there's a number of different challenges. And so we asked in this survey, in this case, the N is about 1,800. Cyber is certainly in there. In fact, the interesting thing was cyber actually. came down slightly. And my thesis on this, Brad, is it's not because cyber is less of a threat. It's because there's so many other things that appear to be even greater issue or more likely to happen compared to in the gray bar of January of this year. So economic uncertainty is not a surprise, unfortunately, that's very, very high on the list. I think somewhat related to that is, can businesses feel like they can pivot? Can they keep up with their customers? And I think the cost of downtime be interesting to see some of the analyst firms if they update their projections, because I know in my own daily life when my wife or myself go online to buy something, if there's a problem with the website, we're literally gone.
Yeah.
We're I'm on to the next search, finding where else can I source that. And frankly, I might be not gone for the day. I'm gone forever from that website or that provider, because if I now establish an experience with someone else, literally just like that, a consistent customer that you may have had, you could actually lose. And so the notion here is the stakes are a little bit higher maybe. The skills one is fascinating to me because I think every single year I've ever seen CIO surveys, I've ever seen independent surveys, vendor surveys, skills are always high. And I just think it comes back to there's never enough good people to go around. That's why you need automation. That's why we need testing to ensure that we're actually validating things. But then, the regulations ones, that's it's somewhat interesting to me. But I think really this notion of digital transformation, I like to use this phrase, and I'll turn it over to you, Brad, but I see this digital divide, sort of have and have nots. And the organizations, much like we said, that they were a little further on ahead, they seem to be benefiting. They seem to be coming through this a little bit better. I see that from a digital transformation perspective as well, meaning some organizations got fearful and they essentially said, we're going to try to weather this storm as if it was going to pass rapidly. We're going to pause. We're not going to continue down some of the initiatives we've had. We're going to be concerned about finances and whatever the case may be, and we're just going to hope that like the tornado passes. And here we are, 8 months later, 9 months later. That obviously didn't happen, meaning that the event didn't completely go away by any stretch of the imagination. Conversely, I had a panel of CIOs like about almost 2 months ago, and almost every single one of them said they used this opportunity of 2020 to accelerate their digital transformation initiatives. In some cases, by not even one quarter, but a half a year, because their view was, if we do nothing, we're not in the same position. We are falling behind. We have to go forward just to try to keep up. And I think that's to try to deal with economic uncertainty, to try to deal with changing customer demands.
And you know what I think is very telling is the first four items is basically what this whole webinar is about. Like as we're going through this, this is what we're kind of talking about, and seeing, that these are the anticipated challenges. This is kind of why we wanted to have this discussion, to bring to light some of these things, to kind of have folks who might be watching this and they are in the latter group that you mentioned, where they're, okay, we're going to just hit pause. We're not going to, invest in our technology space. We're going to just kind of see if this all passes. And if there are still folks out there, even though there's some positive news coming out that, things are going to be hopefully more beneficial at some point, and, everything else, this should be a wake up call, not a, oh, okay, we made it out of this by the skin of our teeth. We're okay. It should be a wake up call in that if you're not doing a lot of these things, looking into, the cloud or work from home or whatever it might be, you really need to start doing that. And I think that the past 9 months have really provided a lot of evidence that that is a valid, you know, it's smart to invest in your technology and look into some of these new emerging things that you can take advantage of.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe double clicking on that, I liked your phrase, cybersecurity hygiene, particularly as it relates from increasingly work from home kind of a landscape. Can you double click on that, unpack that? Because I think it's a really interesting comment.
Yeah, it's something that we don't really think about too much, but when we're work from home, our cybersecurity landscape changes quite drastically. I myself right now, I'm in a public space on a public Wi-Fi. There could be someone snooping around, and I doubt it, but that it's likely that there's someone is. Um, Maybe I'm using a home antivirus. Maybe my kids are on my computer after I'm done playing a game online, and they might click on an ad that download some spyware or ransomware. These are all things that we didn't really need to worry about so much in the actual office world, right? Where you have your computer at the office, you leave it, you're the only one who ever touches it. But listen, work from home, things are very chaotic, and a lot more things can happen that could potentially impact your personal security of your work machine. And you might have an open VPN connection to work. Your child might get on your computer, press the wrong button, the antivirus was uninstalled or hasn't been updated because you don't have an IT guy going around and manually checking anymore, or maybe the monitoring's broken and they haven't gotten to it yet. Any number of reasons that this kind of changes that whole landscape, and suddenly finding yourself in a good position against a lot of ransomware and other cybersecurity threats. Now you have all these potential other access points and all these potential other risks that some folks just might not be thinking about.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that goes back to the landscapes getting more complex, not less complex. And in part it's because we typically don't do a great job of decommissioning things. If you think about like the virtualized environment, but there's still physical servers. If you think about, yeah, you can look at industry reports and it's dominated by Windows and Linux and Apple OS. However, there's still mission critical apps running on AIX or Solaris or iSeries or whatever the case may be. So, you just sort of fan out, like things may minimize, but they don't go to zero. So now you also factor in what you just described, that we're working remotely. Did someone remember to actually turn on the VPN? Did they update the definition? Did they forget to close out an application because now they're very much commingling work and personal activities, or to your point, the family's involved even. I mean, it's imagine going through a pandemic without the internet. Imagine like homeschooling and what that might look like. So there's obvious reasons why we're all online, but that just introduces additional challenges. And I think as we begin to kind of wrap up a little bit, what do you think happens in sort of if we were to have this conversation exactly 1 year from now, so December 16th, 2021, if you were to kind of gaze into 2022, do you think the landscape is a lot different, or do you think it's a continuation of what we've just been chatting about?
So I think it's not going to be so much different in that I don't know if there's going to be any large shifts of, oh, wow, this is how everyone does things now. I think that um, the shift that we might see is going to be around a lot of what we've been talking about today, but a lot of these things might just become a lot more mature. Where we're talking about now how people are surprised that they need to worry about cybersecurity for working from home, for their users working from home, how they need to talk about work from home for DR and moving to the cloud. Those conversations are still going to be there, but I think they're going to be a little bit more mature because this pandemic and everything else has kind of pushed on the innovation in a lot of these spaces. And I think a lot of folks have found as an opportunity where they say, especially in the DR field and cloud and everything else, they say, hey, listen, these are the challenges that you're facing. Whereas before, those challenges were kind of an afterthought. Now they're right in front of you. So let's push this farther. Let's continue to develop the innovations in these spaces. And, you know, we can see the need for the investment. So while I think the conversation is largely going to be the same, I think it's going to be just a little bit more mature. And while we're speculating on a lot of these things now, I think probably in another year, if we're having this conversation, there's going to be a lot more definitive proof into some of the things that we're speculating on, if that makes sense. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm very much an optimistic person, but I think again, you have to be realistic. So I I think we should expect that the first half of this coming year feels exactly like it feels today.
Hmm.
And I think we should hope to be pleasantly surprised, but I mean, let's plan for what's a likely scenario, right? It's nothing wrong with being optimistic, but you better be prepared too. Again, going back to that, you don't get the surprise card to play anymore. But then as we enter back half of next year, if we were having this conversation 1 year from now, I I really believe that people are going to say, "Boy, we're glad that we didn't pause. We're glad that we kept going forward." It's sticking in the middle of the river is not an option. Swim to shore, and go to where your destination is. And I think if, again, I just use the phrase silver lining, none of us would like to have been in this situation, but if fortune favors the bold, and doing nothing is not an option. Not testing is never going to be a good idea. Not exploiting new capabilities, not trying to drive the business forward, not supporting your company's digital transformation objectives is just not a winning strategy whatsoever. So, my hope to net that all out is that what we experience in the next 12 months is like a feedback loop that says, wow, we took some chances, we made some bets, we went forward, and it was beneficial for us. And we're going to go into 2022 with more learning and more confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just taking a look here, we're coming up to the end of our time. So I just want to mention that if anyone on this call listening has some thoughts about this conversation that we've had, and maybe you're thinking, are these guys talking about me? In some of these decisions, if you have some questions about the cloud, about specifically disaster recovery and backup and how work from home affects all these things, this is obviously a webinar sponsored by Veeam and Offsite Data Sync. So feel free to reach out to Offsite Data Sync for any of the cloud side of things. And obviously, Veeam is really the leading player that handles the backup and DR side of this. So this conversation wasn't really much of anything to do with Veeam or Offsite Data Sync in specific, but we just kind of wanted to bring a lot of these topics to light so that we're making sure that everyone is thinking about some of these things, and also just to kind of, bring to the forefront the trends that we've seen. So um, thank you everyone for watching. And Dave, thanks so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Always love talking to you about some of this stuff. And, we could probably go on for another 2 hours if we wanted to, but, um,
Definitely.
but yeah, thank you so much for joining. And I think we'll see if we can open it up for some questions, unless you have some final thoughts, Dave.
Yeah, no, I just echo 100% of what you said. Thank you, so much to everyone. And I have a couple of people that have asked, can I get a copy of the survey? And yep, absolutely. And you know what I'll do? Forgive my little clicking back, but
Yep, go back. Yep.
there we go. I'll leave this on the screen now. So this is actually a QR code that you can look at, but it's also entitled, if you searched under this phrase, to 2020 data protection trends. And part of what we're going to do, if you click on this QR code, is we will follow up with the published 2021 updated version. Again, expect that more in the end of February timeframe. And I would just echo, what Brad said. We intentionally didn't make this a Veeam product, an offsite, data sync services sales pitch. It was really meant to be a discussion to help your decision framework, to help your planning going forward, and to spark the conversation, to begin the discussion, not to be the discussion in totality. So definitely feel free to reach out to Brad, myself, or Offsite Data Sync or Veeam. And just thank you, Brad, for the chat. Always appreciate it. And to everyone out there, I always like to end every live stream or discussion with the phrase, stay safe and stay positive. So thank you.